We had planned this camping trip for weeks, our usual way to unwind before winter set in. Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I packed our tents and sleeping bags, and I'd brought a little extra something, a stash of magic mushrooms to enhance the night. We were miles away from any marked trails, deep in the woods where only the sounds of nature kept us company. We set up camp by dusk, got a fire going, and started our little journey with the mushrooms, watching as the trees seemed to breathe and the stars felt close enough to touch Dot as the fire crackled and shadows danced. Yena suggested we take a walk through the forest. She grinned, saying it'd be creepy, and since we were all a bit out of our minds, it sounded like the perfect idea. We grabbed our flashlights, but something about the inky darkness seemed to swallow the light. Everything felt surreal, as if we'd stumbled into another world. We laughed and whispered as we moved deeper into the trees. But then, from somewhere nearby, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the rhythmic clanking of chains. The sound was distant but getting louder, moving closer. We froze, listening as the noise grew. And then, through the trees, a glow appeared, small pinpoints of light, steadily moving in our direction. Panicked, we ducked into the nearest bushes, crouching low as we peered out to see what was coming. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed to run, but we were too mesmerized by the sight to move. Emerging through the trees, a procession of figures marched forward, each one draped in chains that rattled with every step. They wore white masks that covered their faces completely, expressionless and pale, giving no clue who or what was behind them. There were at least 10 of them, each holding a lantern that cast an eerie glow across their forms. The orange light flickered, illuminating shackles on their wrists and ankles, the chains connecting them to each other. Their movements were mechanical, precise, as if they'd been marching for centuries without a break. We held our breath, too terrified to even think about making a sound. The figures walked in eerie silence except for the relentless clanking of chains, heading right past our hiding spot. My pulse raced as one of them turned slightly, his mask facing directly toward our bush. The lantern light caught his empty eyes, and I felt a cold, uncheckable dread sink into my bones. I thought I'd been seen, but he turned away and kept walking. They moved onward, disappearing deeper into the woods, their lights fading until only the sound of chains remained. We waited until we were sure they were gone, and then we sat in silence, no one daring to speak. We stumbled back to the campsite in a daze, still reeling from what we'd seen. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle in the dark made us jolt. We stayed huddled together, barely able to close our eyes as we listened to the forest around us, half expecting those figures to return. At the first light of dawn, we decided it was time to go. As we approached the camp, something felt off. From a distance, we could see the tents were knocked over, and the fire we'd put out the night before was smoldering again, as if it had just been lit. We exchanged uneasy glances and moved cautiously toward the site. There, etched in the dirt next to our fire pit, was a message: "We will find you." The words looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in the ground mere moments before we arrived. None of us said a word. We knew what we had to do. We quickly packed what little was left of our things, each of us keeping a nervous eye on the trees, half expecting one of those masked figures to emerge. We practically sprinted back to the car, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing down on us the entire way. It wasn't until we were back on the road, the forest fading behind us, that anyone spoke, and even then, it was in hushed tones. We never went back to those woods, and we never told anyone else what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the clanking of chains echoing in my mind, and I see that mask staring through the darkness. I had always loved camping, the smell of pine trees and the sound of a crackling campfire. This time, I was with a few friends, excited to escape the city and enjoy the peace of nature. We hiked deep into the woods, setting up our tents in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that danced across the ground as we gathered around the fire. As night fell, we cooked hot dogs and shared stories, laughing as the stars twinkled overhead. Yena suggested we tell scary stories, which quickly turned into a competition to see who could come up with the creepiest tale. Each story was scarier than the last, but we were all still feeling brave and enjoying the thrill of it. That's when Matt had the brilliant idea to take a night hike. He insisted it would be fun and adventurous, and despite my unease, we all agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and started down the narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The beams of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees that seemed to close in around us. As we walked, the laughter faded and an unsettling silence took its place. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the crunch of twigs underfoot. I felt a chill creeping down my spine, but I brushed it off as nerves. We were just being silly? Right. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the stillness. It sounded like chains clanking together, echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. I could see the fear in Gina's eyes as she whispered that we should head back. But before we could turn around, we spotted something in the distance, a flickering light. It was moving, and with it came the unsettling sound of chains. We quickly ducked behind a tree, our hearts racing. The light got closer, revealing silhouettes of figures draped in dark clothing. They were carrying lanterns, their faces obscured by shadows. The clanking noise grew louder, and I felt my stomach drop. Who were they? Why were they out here? The figures stopped not far from us, standing in a huddle. They looked like they were chanting, their voices low and haunting. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something deeply unsettling about their tone. My hands trembled as I whispered to my friends that we should move away quietly. We slowly backed away, trying to remain as silent as possible. Just as we thought we were safe, one of the figures turned and pointed directly at us. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Their lantern light shone brightly, illuminating the space around us. It was like they could see us, even in the darkness. Panic surged through me, and I motioned for everyone to run. We took off down the path, the clanking of chains and chanting echoing behind us. We sprinted back to our campsite, our hearts pounding in our chests. We reached our tents, breathless and terrified. I glanced around, expecting to see the figures emerging from the shadows at any moment, but nothing came. We sat in a circle, trying to calm each other down, but the fear lingered like a thick fog. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we reluctantly decided to pack up and leave. I still felt shaken by what we had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sun cast a warm glow over the clearing, but it did little to ease my nerves. When we reached the spot where we had pitched our tents, I stopped in my tracks. The fire pit was still warm, but everything else was a mess. Our gear was scattered around, and deep scratches marred the surface of the ground, forming strange patterns. I approached cautiously, my heart racing as I noticed something strange in the dirt. There were words etched into the ground, barely visible but unmistakable. "We will find you." My blood ran cold as the memories of the night flooded back. We quickly gathered our things, the unease creeping back into our minds. We didn't speak as we loaded the car, all too aware that we had intruded into something we didn't understand. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, knowing that something dark lurked within those trees. We never went back. The experience remained an unspoken agreement between us, a secret too terrifying to share. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the distant clanking of chains in my mind, a chilling reminder of what we encountered in those woods. I can't help but wonder if the figures are still searching for us, waiting patiently in the shadows for their chance to make their presence known once more. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip with friends. We chose a remote spot deep in the woods, far from the sounds of the city. The kind of place where you can hear the rustle of leaves and feel the crunch of twigs beneath your feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The air was filled with the smell of roasting marshmallows and the crackling of burning wood. Jenna suggested we go for a night hike to embrace the wilderness. The others were hesitant, but I felt adventurous. The mushrooms we had consumed earlier made everything feel magical, and I wanted to explore. The darkness felt like an invitation, pulling us into its depths. We grabbed our flashlights, the beams slicing through the night like knives. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around us, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the starry sky. We chatted nervously, but the mood shifted when we heard a sudden rustling. It was louder than any animal we'd encountered, like something large was moving through the underbrush. We froze, exchanging anxious glances. Then we heard a low growl that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a wolf. This was something different, Something wrong. Before we could react, Jenna pointed ahead, her flashlight beam flickering over something in the distance. My heart raced as I strained to see what it was. Through the trees, a figure emerged. A man, or at least, he looked like one. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as if he had never seen sunlight. He wore ragged clothes that hung loosely from his body, and his hair was wild, matted with leaves and dirt. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel the emptiness in his eyes. Like he was staring right through us, we instinctively backed away, trying to remain silent. But in our panic, Jenna accidentally stepped on a twig, the sound snapping through the air like a gunshot. The figure jerked his head toward us, and the growl intensified. Fear took hold, and we bolted into the trees, heartbeats racing and breath coming in short gasps. We ran without direction, branches scratching at our arms and legs as we tore through the underbrush. The growl was now a roar, echoing in the night. We could hear footsteps behind us, heavy and deliberate. It felt like something was chasing us, hunting us. I glanced back and saw the man was following, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. We finally stumbled upon a clearing, and without thinking, we hid behind a thick bush, our bodies pressed together, trembling. We listened as the footsteps grew closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my voice away. Then silence. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, I thought we had escaped. We remained crouched, hearts pounding, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Just when I thought we were safe, a rustling came from the bush right next to us. I nearly screamed when I turned my flashlight towards it, only to reveal a raccoon, its eyes reflecting the light before it scurried away. But we were not alone. A whisper came from the shadows. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable. As it grew louder, my heart sank. The voice was low and raspy, calling out Jenna's name. The darkness felt alive, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against us. We dared to look out from behind the bush. To our horror, we saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of our flashlights. He was now closer, his mouth moving as he chanted Jenna's name over and over, each utterance dripping with malice. Just as I thought we were trapped forever, something incredible happened. The figure suddenly stopped, his eyes widened, and he stumbled back, looking terrified. He turned and fled into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were paralyzed, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The chanting stopped, replaced by the sounds of the forest returning to normal. We slowly emerged from our hiding spot, still shaken, but relieved to be alive. As we made our way back to the campsite, we talked about what we had seen. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, even in the safety of the campfire. The horror of that night haunted us, but the morning brought a sense of relief. We quickly packed our things and left. Days later, I received a text from Jenna. She had done some research and discovered that the area we camped in was notorious for strange occurrences. Multiple reports of people vanishing had been recorded over the years, always near that same clearing. But what made my blood run cold was the final line of her message. There's something more. They say if you hear your name whispered in the woods, it means they are looking for you. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of 4: Yana, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yana suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray. Tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. "What happened?" Aaron stammered, his face pale. But the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. We decided to go camping to escape the bustle of city life, a group of 5 friends eager for adventure. We drove deep into the woods, far from the beaten path, excited about the quiet and the stars. Our destination was a secluded clearing near a lake, surrounded by towering pines. The sun dipped behind the trees as we set up camp, and we roasted marshmallows by the fire, telling stories that blended laughter and nervous tension. As night fell, the forest transformed. Shadows deepened, and the sounds of the night came alive, the rustling leaves, distant calls of owls, and the soft croak of frogs from the lake. In the back of my mind, something nagged at me, an unshakable feeling that we weren't alone. I shrugged it off, laughing at my own paranoia. After a few hours, Yena, one of our friends, suggested we take a night walk. She claimed it would be fun, and surprisingly, everyone agreed. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the woods, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The air felt thick, the silence unsettling. Every crunch of twigs beneath our feet echoed like a warning. We wandered deeper until we stumbled upon an old, abandoned campsite. The remains of a fire pit lay overgrown with weeds, and torn bits of fabric flapped eerily in the wind. The chill in the air intensified as we approached. Yena shone her light on the remnants, revealing a rusted can and some tattered ropes. Suddenly, we heard a distant sound like chains dragging across the ground. Our laughter died in our throats as we exchanged glances, confusion and fear mingling in the flickering light. It wasn't just our imaginations. The sound was real and getting closer. Without a word, we turned to run back to our camp, but before we could take more than a few steps, the clanking stopped. We froze, hearts pounding, listening intently. In the distance, faint lights flickered through the trees. They danced and swayed like lanterns, growing brighter and larger. Fear gripped us, and we ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes. I peered through the branches, holding my breath. What emerged from the shadows sent a chill through my spine. Figures clad in white robes shuffled toward us, their faces obscured by masks. Each carried a lantern that illuminated their chains, which rattled with each step. I could see at least 5 of them moving in an eerie procession, their muffled whispers merging with the rustle of leaves. I felt a surge of terror. We needed to stay hidden. The figures paused for a moment, and I could hear their whispered chants, something unintelligible that made the hair on my neck stand on end. My friends and I huddled together, eyes wide with fear. We waited, our hearts racing, praying they wouldn't spot us. The lanterns cast grotesque shadows that flickered and danced, making the scene feel even more surreal. Just when I thought the nightmare might end, one of the figures turned its head slightly, and my breath caught in my throat. The mask seemed to look directly at me. In a panic, we stayed as still as possible, hardly daring to breathe. The figures resumed their slow march, the lights fading into the darkness until they disappeared entirely. We waited a few more minutes before deciding we had to get back to the camp and leave. As we crept back to our campsite, an uneasy silence fell over us. But what we found made my blood run cold. Our campsite had been ransacked. Tents were torn open, and our supplies were scattered across the ground. In the center of the chaos was a newly lit fire, and beside it was a wooden sign we had never seen before. The sign bore a single phrase carved deeply into the wood: "You shouldn't have come here." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. We hurriedly gathered our things, adrenaline coursing through our veins as we looked over our shoulders. We had to leave. Now, we jumped into the car, frantic, and drove away from the woods, leaving the flickering light of our ruined campsite behind. We vowed never to return, but even now, as I sit at home, the memory haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of chains in my dreams. Those masked figures still lurk in my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that they are still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far into their territory. It was supposed to be an easygoing weekend trip, just a simple getaway deep in the woods with my friends. We planned everything out: tents, food, flashlights, and extra batteries. We'd chosen a spot by the lake, miles from the nearest road, so we wouldn't see another soul for days. The first day went perfectly, hiking, swimming, laughing by the fire as the sun went down. The isolation made everything feel a little surreal, like we'd stepped into a world of our own. It was after dinner, with night fully settled around us, that Yena suggested we explore the area. She'd always been the adventurous one, pushing us to do things we wouldn't otherwise. We took our flashlights and set off, joking that she was leading us on a ghost hunt. As we walked, the woods thickened, swallowing our voices and muffling our laughter. Shadows danced along the ground, strange in the beams of our flashlights, and the trees grew denser, leaning over us like they were watching. At some point, the trail split off, and Yena darted ahead before anyone could stop her. We tried calling her back, but she laughed and said she'd meet us back at camp in a few minutes. Not wanting to argue, we kept walking, staying on the main path. We turned back after a while, realizing we'd been gone longer than we'd planned, and headed to the campsite. We figured Yena would already be there, probably lying in wait to jump out and scare us, but the campsite was empty when we returned. Her things were still where she'd left them, untouched. The fire was almost out, just a few embers crackling quietly, casting a faint orange glow over the tents. Panic started to creep in, and we called her name, listening to our voices echo into the dark trees. Silence answered us, thick and unnerving. The minutes ticked by, and then the hours. By now, it was close to midnight, and our nerves were stretched thin. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, made us whip around, expecting Yena to jump out, but the silence dragged on. Just as we were about to head into the woods to search for her, we saw a faint light bobbing in the trees. Relief surged through us. Yena was finally back, but as the light grew closer, something was off. The way it swayed wasn't like a flashlight, it moved fluidly, almost like it was floating. We called out to her, but there was no answer. The light kept moving closer, slow and deliberate, weaving through the trees. Then we saw it, a figure in the dark, cloaked in shadows. It wasn't Yena. The figure was too tall, its movements too stiff. Whoever it was held a lantern that flickered with an unnatural glow, a greenish light that seemed to pulse in the darkness. Chains rattled as the figure moved closer, dragging across the ground. Loud and metallic. My heart pounded as we stumbled back, retreating toward the camp. But the figure kept coming, each step slow, unhurried. The light from the lantern cast strange shadows over its face. It wore a mask, pale and featureless, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare through us. I grabbed my friends, and we hid behind a nearby fallen tree, peering out as the figure entered our camp. It stopped by Gina's tent, standing still as if listening. The chains clanked softly as it reached down, running its hand over her things, pausing for a moment before moving to the next tent. My breath caught in my throat as it lifted the lantern, casting light over the empty tents, the coolers, the dying fire. Then it leaned down, scratching something into the ground with the tip of a chain, the metal scraping against the earth with a terrible sound. After what felt like hours, the figure turned, vanishing back into the trees, the light from the lantern fading with it. We stayed hidden until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Only then did we dare to creep back to our camp, every step careful, as if that figure might suddenly reappear. On the ground, where the figure had knelt, were 3 words carved deeply into the dirt. "She's with us." Gina's belongings were gone. Her backpack, her sleeping bag, even her shoes were missing. Everything she'd brought had disappeared without a trace, leaving no sign that she'd ever been there at all. Without a word, we packed up, leaving behind whatever we couldn't carry. We didn't stop walking until we reached the car, not even looking back as we sped down the narrow, winding road away from that place. To this day, I can still hear the clanking of those chains in my nightmares. And sometimes, just when I think I've forgotten, I'll catch a faint whiff of that strange greenish light just for a second. None of us ever found out what happened to Yena, but we know one thing for certain. Whoever, or whatever, that figure was, it wasn't human. Camping in the woods had always been a cherished tradition among my friends and me. This trip, however, felt different. The forest was eerily quiet, and even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. We set up camp, 4 of us, Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I. As night descended, the atmosphere grew thick with an unsettling tension. After dinner, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to take a walk. Yena suggested we explore the woods under the moonlight, laughing nervously about how spooky it would be. Fueled by the thrill of adventure and maybe a little fear, we agreed. With flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the trees, the path illuminated only by the beams of our lights. Initially, we were caught up in the beauty of the night, the shimmering stars above and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the branches. But soon, the sounds of the forest began to change. A distant rustle, a snap of a twig, and the uncomfortable feeling that something was watching us settled in. The further we walked, the heavier the air felt around us. Then we heard it, a soft clanking, like metal against metal, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as I turned to my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. It seemed to be coming from the direction we had just walked, and in a moment of collective panic, we decided to hide. We ducked behind some thick bushes, our breaths shallow as we strained to hear more. What we saw next made my blood run cold. Lanterns appeared in the distance, bobbing along the forest floor, illuminating the space between the trees. Figures emerged, draped in tattered white clothing, their faces hidden behind eerie masks that seemed to glow in the lantern light. Chains rattled as they walked, shackles on their wrists and ankles clanking with every step. The procession moved slowly, the figures gliding toward our hiding spot as if they were drawn by unseen force. My friends and I exchanged wide-eyed glances, a shared understanding of our predicament settling over us. We remained completely still, our hearts pounding in sync, the tension thick enough to slice through. As they passed, I could see their eyes, or rather, where their eyes should have been. The masks were hollow, devoid of any expression, and I felt an overwhelming urge to scream, but managed to suppress it. The figures moved with a haunting grace, and I wondered if they even knew we were there. They continued on, fading into the depths of the woods, leaving us shaken and terrified. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we dared to move. Finally, we crept back to our camp, only to find it in disarray. The tents were overturned, and the fire pit was smoldering as if it had just been extinguished. Fear twisted in my stomach as we approached the campsite. A cold breeze whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I noticed something on the ground, half hidden by the leaves. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Scrawled in the dirt was a message. "You should not have come here." We all froze, the weight of that ominous sentence hanging heavily in the air. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, suffocating and relentless. We hastily gathered our things, adrenaline fueling our movements, and sprinted back to the car. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves had us glancing over our shoulders, terrified of what might be lurking in the shadows. Once inside the car, we locked the doors and started the engine. As we drove away, I looked back at the trees, the place where we had just been. That's when I saw them, those figures standing at the edge of the woods, illuminated by the moonlight. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching us leave. Later that night, once we were safely back in the city, I checked my phone. A notification lit up the screen. It was a message from Yena, sent while we were in the woods. "Did you see them? They're in the trees. They know we're here." I stared at the screen, confusion washing over me. Had she seen them too? I quickly typed back, asking her what she meant. I stared at the message, waiting for her response, but the screen went dark. Then, I heard it again, the faint clanking of chains in my mind, echoing, haunting. It wasn't over. The woods were not finished with us yet. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and immerse ourselves in nature. My friends and I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, setting up our tents in a secluded area surrounded by towering trees. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. We spent the early evening cooking over the fire, laughing and sharing stories, while the stars began to prick the darkening sky. As darkness settled in, the atmosphere shifted. My friend Lucas, always the jokester, suggested we play a game of truth or dare to spice things up. Amid laughter and playful taunts, Yena, my adventurous friend, dared us to take a night hike into the woods. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, we agreed, grabbing our flashlights and heading into the shadows. The deeper we ventured, the more the forest came alive. The trees loomed around us, their branches creaking in the wind like ghostly whispers. As we walked, I felt an unsettling sensation, like we were being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, convincing myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. We wandered for what felt like an eternity, our laughter fading as we noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. Just then, a sharp sound pierced the silence, a loud crack, like something heavy breaking through the branches. We all froze, shining our flashlights toward the noise. In the distance, we saw a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing between the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Lucas squinted into the darkness, a grin creeping across his face. "Probably just some campers. Let's check it out." Despite my instincts telling me to turn back, curiosity got the better of us. We crept through the underbrush, the flickering light growing brighter as we approached. The air became thick with tension, each step feeling like a mistake. Then, out of nowhere, the lights vanished. "Where did it go?" Yena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before we could answer, the sounds of chains rattling filled the air, sending chills down my spine. Panic washed over us, and we instinctively dove behind a thick bush. Heart pounding, we peered out to see what was happening. My mind raced as I fought to control my breathing. Then we saw them. Figures cloaked in dark, tattered clothing emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by grotesque masks that glimmered in the darkness. Each figure was shackled, chains dragging behind them as they moved with a disturbing, slow grace. Lanterns hung from their hands, illuminating their path and casting haunting shadows on the trees. My stomach dropped as I realized we were not supposed to be here. My instinct screamed for us to run, but we were frozen in place, horror rendering us immobile. The figures shuffled closer, their chains clanking ominously, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had shrunk to just us and them. I felt Gina's grip tighten on my arm, her nails digging into my skin. I opened my mouth to whisper something reassuring, but no words came. Instead, we watched, breathless, as the procession passed mere feet from our hiding place. I thought I saw one of them glance in our direction, but the lantern's light obscured their eyes. Once the figures moved on, we wasted no time scrambling back the way we came. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we raced through the underbrush, branches clawing at our clothes. We burst out of the trees, breathless and terrified, collapsing beside our campfire. But when we reached our campsite, we were met with a shocking sight. Our tents lay toppled, gear scattered across the ground. The fire was extinguished, its embers barely glowing. As we scrambled to gather our things, I noticed something carved into the dirt near the fire pit. "You should not have come." A wave of fear washed over us, and we grabbed our belongings in a frenzy, not bothering to gather everything. As we made our way to the car, I glanced back at the campsite one last time. There was no sign of the figures, but the air felt thick with their presence. We drove away, hearts pounding, vowing never to return. But, as we sped down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a flickering light. It faded quickly, but the sense of dread remained. What if those figures had followed us? What if they were still watching? The dark woods behind us seemed to breathe, hiding secrets I hoped never to uncover. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights alone in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for that Halloween weekend. The air was thick with an eerie silence as I patrolled the trails, the trees standing like dark sentinels under the moonlight. Most campers had left for the season, leaving only a handful of brave souls to brave the chill. I didn't mind. The quiet was almost comforting. That evening, I received a radio call from a family camping in the more isolated part of the park. They were having a Halloween-themed campfire and invited me to join. I was hesitant, but agreed, thinking it would be good to check on them. I set out, flashlight in hand, making my way through the winding trails. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, casting unsettling shadows that danced around me. As I approached their campsite, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The fire flickered weakly, illuminating the faces of the family, two parents and their young daughter, all dressed in Halloween costumes. They greeted me warmly, inviting me to sit with them. The smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air, and laughter echoed through the trees. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then, the girl, dressed as a ghost, pointed to the tree line. "Look, there's someone over there," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I turned to see nothing but the dark outline of the trees. The parents laughed it off, but my instincts kicked in. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light or perhaps an animal. But as I settled in, unease settled in my stomach. The night wore on, and the girl continued to glance nervously toward the woods. She kept insisting there was someone watching us. The adults dismissed her claims, but I felt a prickle of fear. Just then, a loud rustle erupted from the bushes. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, its beam trembling. The parents jumped to their feet, trying to reassure their daughter. But as I stood, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall silhouette. My breath caught in my throat as I shone the light in its direction. The figure was thin and gaunt, its face obscured by a mask, but I could see the glint of something metallic in its hand. The parents screamed, and the girl hid behind her father. "Stay back," I shouted, stepping forward. The figure didn't move, its presence unnaturally still. Just as fear began to take hold, the family bolted in the opposite direction, leaving me alone. My instincts kicked in, and I followed, shouting for them to stop. We ran through the dark forest, panic rising with every step. I could hear the figure following us, its footfalls light yet relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The path twisted and turned, and I began to lose my bearings. The woods felt alive, branches reaching out like claws as we hurried through the underbrush. Suddenly, we burst into a small clearing, the moonlight illuminating our frantic faces. The parents were panting, the little girl crying. Just then, the figure emerged behind us, and I instinctively stepped in front of the family. I was ready to confront whatever horror this was when, without warning, the figure reached up and pulled off its mask. To my disbelief, it was a fellow park ranger I worked with, wearing a goofy smile and holding a fake axe. "Surprise," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. The family and I stood there, stunned. Relief washed over me, quickly replaced by frustration. What the hell was that? I yelled. The ranger explained that he wanted to give the campers a Halloween scare. but clearly, he had taken it too far. The family was just as confused, their fear slowly turning to anger. The little girl, wiping her tears, asked, "Is that a real axe?" "No, sweetheart, it's just a prop," he said, chuckling. Just then, I noticed something behind him, a rustle in the bushes. My heart dropped as I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Out of the shadows stepped a real figure, hunched and menacing, with a glint of silver reflecting in the light. The ranger's face drained of color, and I realized with horror that the prank had attracted something far more sinister. The family and I backed away, panic setting in again as the true danger revealed itself. This was no joke anymore. The ranger dropped his prop and we all turned to run, leaving the clearing behind, our previous fright replaced by sheer terror. The woods, once familiar and safe, now felt like a haunted labyrinth, every shadow a potential threat. In the end, we all survived, but I knew I would never see the woods the same way again. The night had started with a scare, but had turned into something real and terrifying. It reminded me that sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are not just figments of our imagination, and the woods hold secrets that should remain undisturbed. I was working the night shift as a park ranger, a job I had loved since I began. It was late October, and the forest had a magical quality about it, with the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold. That night, the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. I had just finished checking the trails and was preparing to return to the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. A voice emerged, shaky and frightened. It was a family camping about a mile deep in the woods. They said they heard something outside their tent, something big that had been pacing around for hours. I could hear the panic in the father's voice, urging me to come quickly. I reassured him, telling him it was probably just a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down the winding path, hoping to ease their fears. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced with the rustling leaves. As I moved deeper into the woods, I felt a chill run down my spine. The sound of my boots crunching on fallen twigs was the only noise accompanying me. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and I called out to the family as I approached their campsite. The tent stood eerily still, the only movement coming from the wind tugging at the flaps. My heart raced as I called out again, but there was no response. The father had promised they would be awake, but it was as if the night had swallowed them whole. I stepped closer and noticed the tent zipper was slightly open. Something was off. I cautiously unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags lay sprawled across the ground, still warm, but there was no sign of the family. Panic surged through me as I stepped back and scanned the area. That's when I heard a low growl emanating from the trees. It was not an animal's growl. It sounded human, guttural and strained. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, heart pounding as I caught a glimpse of something moving behind the trees. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the shadows. It looked like a man, but was far too thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. It didn't walk. It glided toward me, its eyes reflecting the light like two coals burning in the night. I stumbled backward, fear gripping me as it stepped closer. I spun around and bolted back down the path, adrenaline surging through my veins. The growl grew louder, now accompanied by footsteps that echoed behind me. I dashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. I dared not look back, focusing instead on the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness ahead. As I neared the main trail, I could feel the figure closing in. My heart raced, each beat pounding in my ears. I burst onto the main road, my breath ragged. Just as I thought I was safe, I tripped over a tree root and fell hard onto the dirt, the flashlight skidding away from my grasp. The growl was deafening now, a horrible cacophony of rage and desperation. I scrambled to my feet and reached for the flashlight, but as my fingers closed around the cool metal, I felt a hot breath on my neck. I froze, terror coursing through my body. With a sudden rush of instinct, I turned and swung the flashlight behind me, shining the beam into the face of my pursuer. But it wasn't the terrifying creature I expected. Instead, it was a deer doe with big, frightened eyes. It stood frozen, staring at me, seemingly just as scared as I was. I stood there, bewildered, the growling sound fading into the night. It dawned on me that the family had probably packed up and left in fear. I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts. glancing around. There were no signs of the creature, just the rustling leaves and the gentle sway of the trees. When I made my way back to the ranger station, I realized that sometimes our minds can conjure the most terrifying monsters. In the stillness of the woods, fear had twisted my perception of reality. The shadows played tricks on me, and the fears of the night had become a tangible monster. Yet, as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Something lurked beyond the trees, just out of sight, reminding me that the dark holds more than just the fear of what we see. It also contains the shadows of our imagination. The evening sun was sinking below the horizon as I patrolled the forest trails, the fading light casting long shadows between the trees. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the isolation and beauty of the deep woods, but tonight felt different. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Around dusk, I received a call on the radio about a family camping a few miles from my current position. They reported strange noises surrounding their tent. The mother sounded terrified, insisting it was something big prowling just beyond their campsite. I assured her I would head over immediately. After a quick check of my gear, I set off down the narrow trail. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beams whole. As I trekked onward, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept my radio on, hoping to stay in touch with the family as I approached. When I reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The family's tent was pitched in a small clearing, but there were no signs of life. My heart raced as I called out to them. Silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I stepped closer and peered inside the tent, but it was empty. The sleeping bags lay undisturbed, and the gear was neatly packed. Something twisted in my gut as I wondered where they could be. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the trees nearby. I jumped, spinning around with my flashlight aimed into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. Adrenaline surged through me. I yelled for the family, hoping they would respond, but only the wind answered. I decided to check the surrounding area. I took a few steps into the trees when I heard it, a low growl, rumbling and guttural. It sent chills down my spine. I felt like prey in a predator's territory. I called again, my voice trembling, but there was still no response. I was alone. The growling grew louder, closer. I turned to run back to the clearing, but I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, clattering away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and frantically searched for the light. As I reached for it, I felt something brush against my arm. Panic gripped me, and I recoiled, heart racing. The flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, and as I turned, I saw it. A massive creature stood just a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the light like to glowing coals. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long. A deep growl emanated from its throat, vibrating in the air around me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place. Then, without warning, the creature lunged toward me. I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I sprinted back to the tent, desperately calling for the family as I ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach safety. I burst into the clearing, and to my shock, I found the family emerging from the trees, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked like they had been running too. I quickly waved them over and led them back to their tent. We huddled together, and I explained what I had seen. Just then, we heard the growl again, closer this time. We scrambled into the tent, my heart pounding as I pulled the flap shut. The creature's claws scraped against the tent fabric, and I felt its weight pressing against the structure. It felt like it was toying with us, waiting for us to show ourselves. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the creature stopped. Silence enveloped us. We waited, holding our breath, unsure of what to expect. After a long moment, the family's youngest child whispered, "Where did it go?" I took a deep breath and slowly opened the tent flap. Peering out, the clearing was empty. The creature had vanished. As we stumbled out into the moonlight, I noticed something strange on the ground, a footprint, but not a normal one. It was human-sized and oddly shaped, as if someone had been standing there all along. I turned to the family, and their faces mirrored my shock. What had chased us? Where had it gone? We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. The true horror of the night was not the creature itself, but the fact that it could take on the form of a human. It could be anyone, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting group to stumble upon its domain. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, But this time, I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. Most nights are quiet, but there was one night that has haunted me ever since. It was mid-October, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine. I was on a routine patrol when the eerie stillness settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. Around 8 p.m., I got a call over the radio. A family camping nearby reported strange noises coming from the woods. The father described them as high-pitched screeches followed by low growls. Unlike anything they had ever heard, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I told them I would check it out, trying to keep my voice steady. As I hiked toward their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I could hear the wind rustling through the branches, but there was something else, a low thudding sound echoing in the distance. It felt unnatural, rhythmic, almost as if something was moving through the trees. When I finally reached the campsite, it was eerily quiet. The family's tent stood dark and still, the flickering light of their campfire casting long shadows on the ground. I called out to them, but received no reply. A knot formed in my stomach as I unzipped the tent. Inside, their belongings were scattered, but the family was gone. Their sleeping bags lay untouched, and I noticed a half-eaten bag of marshmallows abandoned by the fire. Then I heard it again, the thudding sound, now closer and more urgent. Panic surged through me. I stepped out of the tent, gripping my flashlight tightly. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe, almost alive. I swept the light around, searching for any sign of the family. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, its shape distorted and unnatural. It looked humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head oddly shaped. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature turned its head toward me, revealing eyes that glowed like embers. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. The creature let out a shriek that pierced the night, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the thudding sound behind me, getting closer with each step. The adrenaline surged through me as I pushed myself harder. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst onto the main trail where I had parked my truck. I fumbled for the radio, breathless as I called for backup. I needed help. I needed to find that family. After what felt like an eternity, another ranger arrived. A flashlight in hand, we retraced my steps back to the campsite, but the creature was gone. I explained everything to my fellow ranger, and we searched the area thoroughly. The family was still missing. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed something unusual. A set of footprints leading away from the campsite, deep imprints in the soft ground that looked far too large to belong to any human. I followed the prints, my heart racing again. They led deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above us. After several minutes of walking, we found ourselves in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, with its trunk gnarled and twisted, and at the base of that tree lay the family's belongings: hiking boots, a backpack, and even a stuffed animal. But there was no sign of them. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a soft whimper. I turned to see the ranger beside me, his face pale and ashen. Then it happened. The ground beneath us shifted, and the massive tree creaked ominously. I stumbled back as I realized the truth. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a trap, a living thing. The roots twisted and curled, reaching out like fingers, searching for more. Suddenly, the tree shuddered violently, and I was knocked to the ground. The ranger shouted, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar that shook the earth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, never looking back. The next morning, the search teams found the family unharmed, wandering near the edge of the woods, unaware of what had transpired. They insisted they had only gone for a short walk and had become disoriented in the darkness. The ranger and I tried to explain, but no one believed us. They had returned unscathed, but I knew what lurked beneath the surface of those woods. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. The night was deeper than usual, the kind of darkness that feels like it has weight. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights in the woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring campers were safe. But this evening felt different. A chill ran through the air, making my skin prickle. The trees loomed above me like ancient giants, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes against the moonlight. Earlier in the day, a family had set up camp near the lake. They were a cheerful group, chatting and laughing as they roasted marshmallows. I'd stopped to make sure they were aware of the park's safety rules, especially about keeping food secure from wildlife. Little did I know that this simple encounter would haunt me. As darkness enveloped the forest, I began my usual rounds. The sounds of the woods were all too familiar: the rustling leaves, the distant hoots of owls, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. But then, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. A woman's scream echoed through the trees. It was raw and desperate, cutting through the tranquil night like a knife. My heart raced as I sprinted toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I approached the lake, the screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made my stomach drop. The family's campfire still flickered in the distance, but their voices were gone. I reached their campsite, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly over the area, searching for any sign of them. The tent stood undisturbed, but the air felt wrong. I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Panic set in as I turned to check the trail leading away from the lake. That's when I saw a shadow darting between the trees, too quick for me to catch a clear glimpse. My instinct screamed for me to run, but I had a duty to protect these campers. I had to find them. I moved cautiously along the path, my flashlight illuminating the foliage as I pushed deeper into the woods. The darkness felt alive, closing in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting. Just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing. There, at the center, was a large figure crouched low, its back to me. I froze, my breath hitching. The figure was wearing something that resembled a tattered shirt, and I could see matted hair hanging down its back. My mind raced with horror stories of what could lurk in the depths of the forest. I stepped back slowly, but the sound of my movement caught its attention. The figure turned, and my blood ran cold. Its face was grotesque, a twisted mockery of a human. Eyes wide and bulging, it opened its mouth in a silent scream. A wave of terror washed over me, and I turned to flee. I sprinted back toward the camp, adrenaline pushing me forward. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, something lurking just out of sight. When I reached the campsite, I found the family emerging from the woods, faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked as if they had seen a ghost. I rushed to them, relief flooding through me. But before I could ask if they were okay, the mother spoke, her voice trembling. She said they had heard whispers in the trees, voices calling to them in the dark. Then, before I could process what she was saying, I caught a glimpse of the figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. I turned to the family, urging them to pack their things quickly. We needed to leave. I grabbed my radio and called for backup, but the signal was weak and crackling. Just as the family hastily packed their gear, I felt a sudden, icy breath on my neck. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the dark. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered like a heavy fog. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and the forest seemed to whisper around us. We managed to get everything packed, and I led them away from the lake, my heart racing. I kept glancing back, half expecting the figure to reappear. When we reached the main road, I finally exhaled, the tension slowly lifting. But as I turned to reassure the family, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They were smiling, their eyes unblinking and vacant. They weren't scared at all. In fact, they seemed utterly calm, as if nothing had happened. My heart raced again, but for a different reason. I stepped back, confusion taking over. They weren't the same people I had spoken to earlier. The woman tilted her head, her grin widening, and whispered, "You shouldn't have come looking for us." The forest felt alive around me, pulsing with something dark and sinister. I stumbled backward, realizing that the woods had claimed them as its own. As I turned to run, the laughter of the family echoed behind me, a haunting reminder of what had happened in those deep woods. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the solitude of the deep woods. The towering trees and the whispering winds had a calming effect, making it easy to forget the chaos of the outside world. However, there was something about that particular night that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep indigo, and the shadows grew longer and more menacing, I was on my usual patrol route, a winding trail that led through some of the densest parts of the forest. A few campers were set up near the river, and as I passed, I waved to them. They seemed lively, roasting marshmallows and laughing under the stars, but their joy felt distant as I continued my rounds. I stopped for a moment to admire the peaceful scene, but an unsettling chill crept over me, cutting through the warmth of my uniform. As I moved deeper into the woods, the sounds of nature faded. The rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets fell silent. I felt a weight in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My flashlight flickered, and I tightened my grip on it, feeling a strange sense of urgency to finish my patrol. Suddenly, I heard a crack, sharp and echoing. I froze, scanning the darkness around me. It could have been a branch breaking, but it sounded too deliberate. I called out, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling in my stomach. No response, just the unnerving stillness of the woods. Then I saw it. A figure, barely illuminated by my flashlight, standing between the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its arms impossibly long, almost scraping against the ground. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure seemed to watch me, its face obscured by shadow. Just when I thought to turn and run, it vanished, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. I continued along the trail, but the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I quickened my pace, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Minutes felt like hours as I made my way back to the campsite. When I finally arrived, the campers were gone, their fire reduced to smoldering embers. I scanned the area, calling out for them, but the only answer was the echo of my voice against the trees. Panic rose within me. Where could they have gone? As I moved closer to the river bank, I noticed something glimmering in the dying light. It was a small, metallic object, a keychain shaped like a bear. It didn't belong to me, and I had never seen it before. The realization sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned to head back to my truck, but a noise stopped me in my tracks. Laughter. It was distant and warped, almost childlike, but it made my blood run cold. I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the responsibility to search for the campers. Following the sound, I ventured toward the river. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees, and my flashlight flickered again. In a clearing near the water, I saw them. The campers were standing in a circle, their backs to me, seemingly oblivious to my presence. Relief washed over me, but as I approached, I felt an unnatural chill. The laughter stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. I called out, but they didn't turn around. When I was close enough to see their faces, my heart dropped. They were smiling, but it was not the joyful smile of campers. Their eyes were vacant, as if they were in a trance. In that moment, the world around me shifted, and I realized they weren't alone. The tall figure I had seen earlier loomed behind them, its arms outstretched, almost cradling them in an embrace. Instinct kicked in. I shouted at them to run, my voice breaking through the silence. They snapped out of their stupor and turned to me, their eyes wide with fear. We bolted together, racing back through the trees, my flashlight flickering wildly. I didn't stop running until we reached my truck. I ushered the campers inside, still glancing back at the dark woods, half expecting the figure to appear again. I drove us out of the park in silence, my heart pounding in my chest. As we reached the edge of the forest, the air seemed to clear. The campers thanked me for saving them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in them, that they had left a part of themselves behind in the woods. And even as I drove away, I knew the woods held their secrets tight, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too deep into their grasp. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner. As if someone had left in a hurry, my instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping. But as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. I had been a park ranger for a few years, spending countless nights in the woods and feeling a sense of peace in the rustling leaves and the sounds of nature. But that October night, everything changed. The sky was dark, thick clouds cloaking the moon, and the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness. As I patrolled the trails, the crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I was nearing a remote campsite when my radio crackled to life. A distressed voice came through. A group of campers had reported hearing strange noises outside their tents. The father insisted it sounded like someone or something was moving around their campsite, heavy footfalls and a low growl. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that it was probably just a bear, but I could hear the fear in his voice. After gathering my gear, I set off toward the campsite. The path was winding and overgrown, making it hard to see far ahead. With my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the trees cast long, eerie shadows that danced around me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I pressed forward, the feeling of being watched creeping in. When I finally reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the unsettling silence. I called out, but there was no response. I stepped closer and found the tent zipped up tight, a warning sign that sent a chill down my spine. I unzipped the door and peeked inside. It was empty, the sleeping bags neatly arranged as if no one had ever been there. My heart raced as I turned to look around the campsite. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise from the bushes nearby. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, moving with a jerky, unsettling gait. I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice cracked. The figure stopped and turned its head slowly, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. I remembered my training and reached for my radio, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure didn't advance. It simply stood there, watching me. The woods around us felt like they were holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation. I turned and sprinted back down the path, my mind racing. I could hear branches snapping behind me and the sound of something following, moving faster than it should have been. As I ran, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me, the trees towering like sentinels. I burst out onto the main trail and didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally got inside, slamming the door shut. I took a moment to catch my breath before calling for backup, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, but inside I was a mess. While I waited for the other rangers to arrive, I decided to circle back to the campsite. Maybe I could find the family and lead them to safety. As I approached, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The area looked different, almost distorted. I scanned the trees but saw no sign of the figure. The tent was still zipped up tight, and the campsite was eerily quiet. I crept closer, my flashlight beam trembling. I unzipped the tent once more, but this time, it was empty. My heart sank. Where had they gone? A rustling noise drew my attention again, and I turned just in time to see the figure dart between the trees. Panic surged, and I turned to run, but as I did, I tripped over something hidden in the leaves. I fell forward and looked back. The figure was right there, only inches from me, but as I scrambled to my feet, something strange happened. The creature changed shape, morphing into the father from the camping family, his face twisted with fear. I blinked, and he vanished, replaced by shadows that danced among the trees. I stumbled back toward the road, my mind racing with confusion. Just as I reached the trailhead, the other rangers arrived. I told them everything, but as we searched the woods, we found nothing. No campers, no sign of a struggle, just an overwhelming silence. Days later, the park officials declared the area closed until further notice. But sometimes, when I walk the trails alone at night, I can still hear the rustling of leaves and that haunting growl. I wonder if the woods still hold the family, or if they became part of something far darker. The figure I saw, the one that looked like the father, was never found, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered in those woods still lingers, watching and waiting. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, but the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and packed my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream, piercing and desperate, coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone, no footprints in the mud, no sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone, "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. The night had settled in the forest like a heavy blanket, and as a park ranger, I was used to the eerie calm that enveloped the woods after sunset. The campgrounds were closed for the season, but I had to make my rounds to ensure no one had sneaked in for an illicit camping trip. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost deafening. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted branches and underbrush. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual: a tent set up deep in the woods, far from the designated camping area. My heart raced. The site was supposed to be closed for the season, and no one should be there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As I got closer, I could see the tent was unzipped but empty. The campfire pit lay cold and dark, a few charred logs scattered around. I scanned the area, calling out if anyone was there, but only the wind answered. I was about to turn back when I noticed a backpack near the tent, half open, and inside, I caught a glimpse of a child's drawing. It was crude but depicted a family camping. My gut twisted. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence: laughter. Distant yet unmistakable, it echoed through the trees, high-pitched and childish. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Children shouldn't be out here alone, especially in the dead of night. I made my way toward the sound, heart pounding. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling stillness. Then, I heard something else: a low growl, unlike anything I had heard before, It sent a bolt of fear through me. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to see beyond the trees, but nothing moved. I hesitated, trying to rationalize the noise, convincing myself it was just an animal. With a deep breath, I continued, hoping to find the children and bring them back to safety. I stumbled into a small clearing and spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, among the foliage, stood a tall figure, its back turned to me. It wore what appeared to be a tattered, oversized sweater, the hem dragging along the ground. I called out, but it didn't move. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, as if sensing my presence. I felt the air grow heavier, and a chill swept over me. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I took a cautious step forward, and the figure suddenly turned around. My flashlight flickered against its face, a twisted, unsettling mask that was neither human nor animal. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and it opened its mouth to let out a haunting sound that mimicked laughter. The growl I heard earlier grew louder, but I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, heart racing. I crashed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes. I sprinted back toward the path, but the laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, getting louder with each step. As I emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath, I nearly collided with a family of 3 parents and a young child, their eyes wide with confusion. They must have arrived just as I was fleeing. I hurriedly explained what I had seen, the laughter, the figure. They listened, faces pale and frightened, but before I could convince them to leave, the laughter echoed again, louder this time, and the figure emerged from the tree line behind them. I shouted for them to run, and they turned in terror. The family sprinted down the path as I grabbed my radio, frantically calling for backup. I didn't look back until I reached the main ranger station, heart pounding. When the other rangers arrived, we formed a search party, but the woods were silent. We combed the area, but there was no sign of the figure, the tent, or the family I had seen. Hours passed with no trace, and as dawn broke, the sun illuminated the woods with a haunting beauty. Later, as we gathered to regroup, I heard the same high-pitched laughter wafting through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I turned to my fellow rangers, trying to shake off the growing dread. As we discussed the plan, I caught a glimpse of the child from the family had encountered earlier, standing at the edge of the woods, a grin on his face. But it wasn't just any grin. It was the same twisted smile I had seen on the figure. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The child wasn't lost. He was part of whatever was lurking in the woods, and now they had returned, watching, waiting. I had no idea what horrors lay ahead. The laughter echoed again, and I felt the woods close in around me. As a park ranger, I had spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods, but one October evening still stands out in my mind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. I was assigned the late shift, my radio crackling softly as I moved through the trails, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. It was a typical night until I received a call from a couple camping in a secluded area about 10 miles into the woods. They reported hearing strange noises, a mix of growls and whispers that sent shivers down their spines. I tried to calm them, assuring them it was likely just a nearby animal, but their fear was palpable. I told them I would head their way and check things out. The hike to their campsite was uneventful at first, the familiar sounds of the forest filling my ears. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds faded, and an unnatural silence enveloped me. My flashlight flickered, and I shook it, hoping to coax it back to life. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Goosebumps prickled my skin, and I quickened my pace. When I finally reached the couple's campsite, the sight that greeted me sent a chill down my spine. Their tent stood in disarray, the zipper partially open, and belongings scattered around as if a storm had swept through. But the couple was nowhere to be found. I called out their names, but only silence answered. My instincts kicked in, and I moved cautiously, scanning the area. As I walked further into the woods, I stumbled upon a trail of what looked like deep claw marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees. My heart raced as I followed the marks, trying to piece together what had happened. Each claw mark seemed to lead deeper into the shadows, beckoning me forward. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I took a deep breath and pressed on, hoping to find a couple or at least something that would explain their disappearance. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart raced as I followed the movement, adrenaline surging through me. I stumbled upon a small clearing where I saw a figure standing with its back to me. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. My instinct screamed for me to run, but curiosity held me in place. I called out softly, asking if they were okay, but the figure remained motionless. A chill ran down my spine, and I took a cautious step closer. Just as I was about to reach out, the figure turned. My stomach dropped as I caught sight of its face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back in shock, and the figure opened its mouth to let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned to flee, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted back the way I came. Behind me, the figure's scream echoed through the trees, a haunting sound that filled the air. I could hear the rustling of leaves and snapping branches as it pursued me, but I didn't dare look back. I finally burst through the tree line and into the clearing where the couple's tent still stood. Panting, I skidded to a stop, turning to face the forest. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The growling returned, echoing through the trees, and I, prepared for whatever might come. Just then, the couple emerged from the woods, their faces pale with fear. They looked as if they had seen a ghost, and I couldn't help but feel relief wash over me. They told me they had wandered off looking for firewood and had gotten lost, but as I looked back into the forest, I noticed something chilling. The figure I had seen was standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching us with those same hollow eyes. I grabbed the couple and we hiked back to the ranger station, glancing over our shoulders, convinced that whatever had followed us was still lurking in the shadows. We made it safely back, but as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let something dark escape the woods that night, a presence that was no longer confined to the deep trees. The sun had set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the campsite as I finished my rounds. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the woods at night, but something about this evening felt different. The air was thick, and the wind whispered through the branches like an ominous warning. It was late October, and the chill in the air hinted at winter's approach. I was on my way back to the main office when I heard a faint, desperate cry echoing through the woods. It was unlike any animal call I had ever heard. I froze, straining my ears to catch it again. There it was, a chilling scream followed by a rustling in the bushes nearby. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight, turning toward the sound. I had always been taught to investigate, to help anyone in trouble. I began to walk slowly toward the noise, each step filled with uncertainty. As I moved deeper into the trees, the darkness enveloped me, and my flashlight beam flickered against the trunks. The scream came again, more frantic this time, urging me to hurry. I rounded a large oak and found myself at a small clearing. In the center was a campsite with a flickering fire, its warmth contrasting sharply with the chill in the air. I stepped closer, my heart racing as I called out to see if anyone was there. "Hello, is anyone there?" No answer. The campsite was empty, the tent still pitched, and the fire crackling quietly. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound behind me, a quick rustle of leaves, followed by an unmistakable growl. My breath hitched in my throat, and I swung the flashlight around, illuminating the dense tree line. I saw nothing, only the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I was about to turn back when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure darted between the trees, just beyond the light's reach. My heart raced as fear gripped me. I called out again, "Who's there?" "Show yourself." The growl came closer, a low rumble that reverberated in my chest. I felt a surge of adrenaline, and against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I stepped cautiously toward the trees where I had seen the figure, every instinct telling me to turn back. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I spotted a flash of white, a shirt or a jacket vanishing deeper into the woods. I called after it, but there was only silence. Then, I noticed something on the ground, a child's teddy bear, its button eyes staring up at me, unblinking. My stomach twisted, a chill ran down my spine. Where had the child gone? Before I could dwell on the bear, the growl returned, this time much closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My flashlight flickered, and the beam caught something moving in the darkness. A large figure emerged from the shadows, its form grotesque and misshapen. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. It was a man, but not just any man. His limbs were elongated, and his skin appeared stretched over his bones. He grinned at me, revealing rows of jagged teeth, the moonlight glinting off them. He raised a hand as if to wave, but it was all wrong. I turned and ran, adrenaline propelling me through the trees. I could hear him behind me, his laughter echoing through the woods, sending ice through my veins. The path was familiar, but the fear twisted my perception. I raced past the empty campsite, barely glancing back, praying I could reach the main office. Just as I broke through the trees, I stumbled onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. I turned to look back, expecting to see the twisted figure closing in on me. But the woods were quiet again, as if nothing had ever happened. The campsite remained untouched, the fire still crackling softly. I made it back to the office, heart pounding, ready to call for help. But as I reached for the door, I froze. In the office window stood a child, her face pale and expressionless. It was the same girl whose teddy bear I had found. She raised her hand and pointed at me, her finger tracing a line from my chest to her throat. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The man I had seen was not just a creature. He was a part of something much darker. I turned to run again, but the door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside with the specter of the forest's lost souls. As a park ranger, I was accustomed to the tranquility of the woods. My shifts usually involved checking on campers, patrolling trails, and ensuring everything was in order. However, that one evening in late October, everything changed. It started innocently enough. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. I was making my rounds when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. At first, I assumed it was just a camper's fire, but something about it felt wrong. The light was too erratic, almost frantic. Curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. The trail quickly disappeared, swallowed by dense foliage and thick underbrush. The deeper I ventured, the more the atmosphere changed. The chirping of crickets faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that wrapped around me like a heavy fog. My flashlight beam danced nervously among the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Finally, I reached a small clearing. In the center, I found a small campfire, its flames sputtering and nearly extinguished. But there were no signs of any campers, no tents, no gear, nothing. The air grew colder, and my instinct screamed at me to leave. Just as I turned to go, I heard a low, deep growl emanating from the darkness beyond the clearing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl came again, closer this time. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating the trees around me. That's when I saw a figure lurking just beyond the reach of my light. It was massive, a hulking shadow with glistening eyes that reflected the light like a predator sizing up its prey. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through my veins. I wanted to run, but fear rooted me in place. The creature stepped forward, its form becoming clearer. It had a grotesque humanoid shape, but its limbs were elongated and twisted. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, a branch snapped behind me. I turned, instinctively shining my flashlight in that direction. To my utter disbelief, I saw a camper standing there, eyes wide with terror. It was a young man, trembling as he pointed into the woods. "We have to go, it's coming." Before I could respond, the creature lunged forward, its growl echoing through the trees. We sprinted back the way I had come, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls chasing us. The woods transformed into a labyrinth of shadows as I navigated through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. We finally emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath. I turned to the young man, who looked as pale as a ghost. "What was that thing?" I asked. He shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know. We were camping, and then we heard it. It just appeared out of nowhere." As we stood there, trying to catch our breath, the air around us grew cold again. I glanced back into the woods, my flashlight illuminating the darkness. I half expected the creature to charge at us again, but the forest was eerily quiet. The young man and I decided to hike back to the ranger station together. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature lurking just behind the trees. But we made it back without incident. The next morning, I reported the encounter to my supervisor. We organized a search for the creature, but found nothing. The campers who had been in the area were nowhere to be found either. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Months later, as I was going through old reports, I stumbled across a case from a decade prior. A family had gone missing in the very same woods, the last sighting being a flickering light deep in the forest. My blood ran cold as I read about the circumstances surrounding their disappearance. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that creature haunted my thoughts. The next day, I decided to return to the clearing, hoping to find some trace of the campers. As I approached the spot, I saw something glinting in the dirt. It was a broken watch, one that looked eerily familiar. I picked it up, my breath hitching as I read the inscription. It was the same watch the young man had worn. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The woods were not just watching, they were waiting for someone to join them. I had just completed my first year as a park ranger, and with summer fading, the woods had begun to quiet down. The leaves were turning, casting a kaleidoscope of color over the hiking trails, and I was preparing for the final weekend of camping season. I was patrolling a section of the forest known for its secluded beauty, a favorite spot for campers. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the faint rustle of leaves created a serene atmosphere, perfect for reflection. As evening approached, I decided to check on a group of campers who had reserved a site deep in the woods. They were known to stay up late, so I wasn't surprised when I found their campfire still crackling. I introduced myself, and they welcomed me warmly. There were 4 of them, sitting around the fire, swapping ghost stories. I joined in, sharing a few tales of my own, feeling the camaraderie that comes from being out in nature. As the night wore on, the laughter faded, and the conversations turned more serious. One of the campers, a young woman named Sarah, told a story about how her uncle had once gone missing in these very woods. She described how he had heard voices calling him deeper into the forest and never returned. The atmosphere shifted as the group exchanged uneasy glances, and I tried to reassure them that such tales were often exaggerated. After all, I was a ranger, and I had always felt safe here. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks in the flickering firelight. I bid the campers good night, promising to check in on them in the morning. As I walked back to my patrol vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The woods felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced before, each rustle amplifying my senses. That night, I drove to a nearby ranger station and settled in, my mind still lingering on the campers' stories. I dozed off, only to be awakened by the sound of my radio crackling to life. A distressed voice broke through the static. A panic-stricken Sarah was calling for help. The signal faded in and out, but I could make out urgent pleas for assistance. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped into my truck, the adrenaline surging as I raced back to the campsite. The drive was tense, the trees looming like dark sentinels. I arrived to find the campfire now reduced to glowing embers. The tent was unzipped, but there was no sign of the campers. I called out for them, but the only response was the haunting echo of my voice in the stillness. My instincts screamed for me to search the area. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the darkness enveloped me. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the shadows, illuminating twisted roots and gnarled branches. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, almost like a child's laughter carried on the wind. I froze, my heart racing, and strained to listen. The laughter faded into a chilling silence, replaced by a low growl emanating from the thicket nearby. Against my better judgment, I approached the sound. The growl intensified, a primal warning that sent shivers down my spine. I aimed my flashlight toward the noise and nearly dropped it when I saw a creature lurking just beyond the trees. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with elongated limbs and hollow, hungry eyes that glinted like shards of glass. Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, the creature's growl echoing in my ears. I sprinted back to the campsite, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew I had to get to my truck and call for backup. Just as I reached the clearing, I heard a commotion behind me. I spun around, ready to confront whatever was chasing me, only to find the campers emerging from the trees, their faces pale with fear. They explained that they had gone for a midnight hike, drawn by the same laughter I had heard. They had stumbled upon the creature, which had terrified them into fleeing. We all scrambled into the truck, hearts pounding, and I radioed for help. As we sped away from the woods, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a fleeting moment, I saw the creature standing at the edge of the trees, its hollow eyes fixed on us, but then it vanished into the darkness. We were shaken, but grateful to have survived the night. However, as we recounted our experience back at the ranger station, we discovered that the campers had been missing for nearly 2 days. My heart sank at the realization we had encountered something supernatural in those woods, and the shadows were far more treacherous than I ever imagined. As a park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences in the deep woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that chilly October evening. It was the end of the camping season, and the air was filled with a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. I was on patrol, ensuring the last few campers packed up and left before dark. I was nearing a secluded part of the park when I noticed a flickering light through the trees. Curious, I veered off the trail, thinking it might be a camper who had lost their way. The forest grew denser as I approached, and the sunlight dimmed. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the shadows loomed heavier and the air turned thick with tension. As I crept closer, I saw a tent. The glow of a lantern inside flickered rhythmically, casting ghostly shadows. I called out, but there was no response. I cautiously stepped up to the tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, all huddled together, fear etched on their faces. I asked what was wrong, and they glanced at each other, their eyes wide. The father spoke in a hushed tone, saying they heard strange noises outside. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night progressed, it grew more unsettling. He mentioned hearing what sounded like whispers and the rustling of leaves. But then came the worst part. Just before I arrived, they saw a shadow pass by their tent, something tall and thin, that walked onto legs, but didn't look entirely human. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably just a deer or another animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I suggested they pack up and follow me back to the ranger station. They agreed, relieved to leave the tent behind. As we began to gather their things, I noticed something strange outside. The whispering had returned. It was a low, unintelligible sound, echoing from the depths of the trees. The family froze, their eyes darting around, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but all I could see was the black expanse of trees. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an angry wind. I told everyone to stay close and led them away from the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us. We turned to see the lantern flicker violently before going dark. Panic surged through the family as I pushed them to move faster. We trudged through the underbrush, branches snagging at our clothes, the whispers following us, echoing like a taunt. The feeling of being haunted crept into my bones. We reached the trail, and relief flooded over me as we emerged into the dim light of dusk. I hurried the family along the path, keeping an eye over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. My blood ran cold as the whispers shifted to a chilling laughter that made my stomach churn. I urged the family to keep moving, and we hurried down the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We finally reached the ranger station, where I quickly ushered them inside. As I locked the door behind us, I glanced back out into the woods. The figure was gone, but the laughter lingered, an echo that hung in the air. After the family calmed down, I began to explain what had happened, hoping to downplay the fear. But just then, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was another ranger reporting strange noises and shadows seen near a different campsite. My heart dropped as the realization hit me there were more campers in danger. I turned to the family and promised them they would be safe inside while I went to assist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was now angry at us for our intrusion. As I ventured back into the woods, the laughter returned, taunting me. I followed the sounds. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The trees closed in around me, and suddenly I tripped over a root, tumbling to the ground. When I looked up, the figure loomed over me, closer than before. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the station. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut and locked it. Breathing heavily, I turned to find the family staring at me, their faces pale. But behind them, in the shadows, stood the very same figure that had chased us. Its eyes flickered in the dim light, a sinister grin spreading across its face. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The woods were alive, and it would always have a way to reclaim what was taken from it. The laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew we had merely survived a night in its domain. But as long as we remained vigilant, perhaps we could outlast its terrifying grasp. As a park ranger, I often patrolled the deeper parts of the woods where few ventured. I loved the solitude, the way the trees enveloped me like a protective embrace. But on one chilly October evening, that solitude took on a sinister edge. I was finishing my last round before heading back to the ranger station. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the setting sun painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. I had my radio tuned to the channel that connected me with other rangers, and as I walked, I felt a sense of unease creeping in. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. A frantic voice came through. A family camping nearby reported hearing strange noises. The father described it as a low growl, followed by something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced. I assured him I'd head their way and investigate. The family was about 1.5 miles from where I was. I picked up my pace, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. As I neared their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees, tall and ancient, creaked as the wind picked up. I could almost feel them watching me, the shadows lurking just beyond the reach of my light. When I finally arrived, the tent stood eerily still. I called out to the family, but there was no answer. Anxiety twisted my stomach as I unzipped the tent flap. Inside, the sleeping bags were neatly folded, and personal items were still scattered about. But no one was there. Just then, I heard a deep, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It sent a chill down my spine. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the sound, and my beam fell on a large figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its silhouette was too thin. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but the eyes, my God, the eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. I felt my instincts scream at me to run. I took a step back, and that seemed to provoke it. The figure stepped forward, the ground crunching beneath its weight. I bolted. I sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at my arms as I navigated the darkened path. Behind me, I could hear it following, moving with a speed that defied nature. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath as I raced toward the ranger station. When I arrived, I quickly grabbed my radio and called for backup. I relayed everything I'd seen, though my words felt jumbled and frantic. A few minutes later, another ranger arrived. We decided to head back to the campsite together, flashlights in hand. As we approached, I felt a mix of dread and relief. I wasn't alone anymore. The air was colder now, the forest seemingly holding its breath. We found the campsite just as I had left it, except now, a tent flap rustled gently in the breeze. My fellow ranger and I called out again, but still no answer. With a growing sense of foreboding, we shone our lights around, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a prickle of panic. The figure could be nearby. We decided to search the area, staying close to one another. As we scoured the perimeter, I noticed something out of place on the ground, a set of deep, claw-like tracks leading away from the tent. They looked disturbingly human, but with elongated fingers that should not exist. I followed the tracks, my heart racing. They led to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing a dark, swirling mist. It felt wrong, unnatural. Suddenly, from the mist, a figure emerged. I recoiled, shining my flashlight at it, but as the beam illuminated the figure, I froze. It was the family, standing perfectly still, their faces blank and eyes wide. They weren't moving, but their bodies seemed to ripple, as if made of smoke. I stumbled backward, gasping as the mist began to close in around me. The ranger grabbed my arm, pulling me away. We ran back to the campsite, leaving the mist and the eerie figures behind. When we finally reached the ranger station, I turned to look back at the clearing. It was gone. The family, the mist, everything had vanished as if it never existed. We reported it, but when the authorities searched the area, there was nothing, no tracks, no signs of the family. It was as if they were swallowed by the forest. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night was more than a mere shadow. It lingers in the depths of the woods, waiting, watching. The park reopened, but I can never bring myself to go back to that part of the woods. The shadows seem to whisper secrets I am too afraid to hear. It was late October when I got called for an evening patrol deep in the woods. I had been a park ranger for a few years, but I had never seen the woods this empty. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red, but a chill in the air warned me that winter was creeping in. My radio crackled with static as I drove deeper into the forest. I flipped on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dense trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods transformed into an eerie labyrinth of shadows. I stopped at a clearing where a family had set up camp. They were enjoying a quiet night by the fire, laughter echoing in the silence. I waved and continued on my patrol, reminding myself to check back later. The forest felt alive. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the distant hoot of an owl all combined to create an unsettling symphony. As night fell, the family's laughter faded into the distance, replaced by a profound silence. I made my way to the nearby trails, feeling the hairs on my neck prickle. It was then that I heard something, a low, guttural growl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the direction of the family's campsite. I radioed dispatch, but received no response. Anxiety coursed through me as I made my way back to the clearing. The fire was now just glowing embers, the tent sagging and unlit. I called out, hoping for a reply. Silence. Then I saw a dark figure, lurking just beyond the tree line. My flashlight flickered, illuminating the creature for a split second. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes glowed like embers. I stepped back, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. I had to get to the family. As I ran, the air grew colder. I stumbled into the campsite, breathless and panicked. The tent was empty, and their belongings lay scattered. I yelled for them again, the sound echoing through the stillness. Just then, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned, flashlight raised, ready to confront whatever was there. The figure stepped into the light, but it wasn't what I expected. It was the father from the family, his eyes wide with fear. He looked disheveled, as if he had been running. He grabbed my arm, breathing heavily. "It's not safe here," he gasped. "We need to leave now." Before I could ask what happened, I heard the growl again, closer this time. The man's grip tightened. We rushed away from the campsite, stumbling through the underbrush. The darkness closed in around us, and I could feel the weight of something behind us. I led him toward the road, but just as we reached the edge of the forest, I glanced back and saw the creature. It was closer now, its twisted form illuminated by the moonlight. Panic surged through me, and I yelled for the father to hurry. We ran, pushing ourselves through the thick brush, the creature's growls echoing in the night. Just when I thought we would be overtaken, we burst out onto the road. The safety of the streetlights was a relief, but I dared not look back. We collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath. I turned to the father, ready to ask what he had seen. His face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "We thought it was just a bear," he stammered. "But it wasn't. It was something else." As we sat there, catching our breath, I noticed the lights of my truck in the distance. Relief washed over me, but as I stood to head toward it, I glanced back one last time. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching us. It tilted its head, and in that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Where its mouth should have been was an empty, gaping hole, just a dark void. In that instant, everything shifted. I turned to the father, ready to shout a warning, but before I could speak, he collapsed. I rushed to him, panic setting in. He was gone, lifeless, but the terror wasn't over. As I looked back toward the woods, the figure was now gone, just darkness. The weight of dread settled in my stomach, and I realized the truth. It hadn't been just a creature, it had been feeding on fear. I got up, my heart racing. I sprinted toward my truck, knowing the woods held more secrets than I had ever imagined. Whatever had taken that family was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I had always loved the solitude of the woods. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these natural wonders, but I also enjoyed the peace that came with the deep trees and endless trails. However, my perspective shifted during a chilling autumn night that I still can't shake. It was late October when the leaves transformed into brilliant reds and golds, drawing visitors to the park for one last glimpse before winter. I was scheduled for a night shift, checking the campsites and ensuring everyone was safe. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my rounds. The campgrounds were mostly empty. The few campers that remained were huddled around their fires, sharing ghost stories. I smiled at their laughter, but it faded quickly as I walked deeper into the woods. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and a sense of unease began creeping in. About an hour into my shift, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. I paused, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unnerving, almost deliberate. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but only darkness greeted me. I hesitated, but the sound stopped, and I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal. I continued my patrol, but that feeling of being watched lingered. When I reached the farthest campsite, I noticed a flickering light. I approached cautiously, thinking it might be an unattended fire. Instead, I found a tent with the flap wide open and no one around. Inside, there were scattered belongings and a half-eaten sandwich lying on the ground, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in. Something felt very wrong. I called out for the campers, but there was no response. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I decided to check the nearby trails, but as I walked away from the campsite, I heard it again, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. It sent chills down my spine, but I pressed on, trying to rationalize it as my imagination. The forest seemed to darken as the wind picked up, carrying a sudden coldness that wrapped around me. I hurried back to the campsite, but the tent was still empty. Panic began to set in as I fumbled for my radio to call for backup, but the device crackled with static. I was alone. I decided to head back to the main road, thinking I could catch a passing ranger or even a hiker. But the deeper I walked, the more disoriented I felt. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out any trace of moonlight, and I realized I had lost my way. The growl returned, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. My heart raced as I turned to run, but then I saw a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the trees. It was tall and emaciated, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed like two cold embers in the dark. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My instincts kicked in, and I took off in the opposite direction, adrenaline coursing through me. As I ran, branches snagged at my clothes, and the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. The growling intensified behind me, chasing me through the maze of trees. Just when I thought I was safe, I tripped over a root and fell. The wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet and glanced back. The figure had stopped, but I could feel its gaze boring into my back. Desperate, I sprinted toward a clearing, praying it would lead me to safety. Bursting into the open, I spotted the campers I had seen earlier. They were standing by their fire, but something was off. Their faces were blank, eyes wide and unblinking. They stared past me into the darkness of the woods. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. I turned to see the figure emerge from the trees, and the campers began to scream. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized the campers weren't frozen in fear. They were entranced, caught in some horrifying spell. In that moment, the figure lunged at them, but just before it could reach them, it vanished into thin air. The campers blinked and suddenly returned to normal, confusion etched on their faces. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if I had lost my mind, but the figure was gone, leaving only an echo of its growl behind. The campers recounted their own experiences of feeling watched, of shadows moving just out of sight. We all made it back to the ranger station that night, shaken but alive, leaving the mystery of the woods behind us. Yet sometimes, as I patrolled the park, I catch glimpses of glowing eyes watching from the trees, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. The stars overhead shine brightly, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor, but there are times when that beauty feels sinister. One October night, my shift began like any other, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. I was out on the usual trail, checking campsites and making sure everything was in order. The air was crisp, and the wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I had just finished my rounds when I got a call on the radio from a couple camping a few miles deeper in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent, things that sounded like whispers and shuffling feet. I told them I would head over immediately, assuring them it was probably just the wind. As I hiked through the dense underbrush, unease settled in my stomach. The noises they described didn't sit well with me. I picked up my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the gnarled roots and thick brush. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My flashlight flickered intermittently, and I mentally cursed the batteries. Finally, I reached the couple's campsite. Their tent was pitched, but eerily quiet. I called out to them, but there was no response. I approached the tent and carefully unzipped it, peering inside. It was empty. Sleeping bags were still rolled up, their belongings neatly stowed, but they were nowhere to be found. My heart raced. I stepped back, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or distress. That's when I heard it, a low growl, reverberating through the trees. I felt it in my bones, a primal sound that struck fear into my heart. I quickly turned, shining my flashlight in every direction. The forest was still, but I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor creeping in. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement behind a nearby tree. I shined my flashlight toward it. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. It looked like a man, but was unnaturally thin, almost emaciated. His skin glimmered in the flashlight's beam, pale and sickly. He held a hand up as if trying to shield himself from the light. But what struck me were his eyes. They were wide and wild, filled with an unsettling mix of fear and hunger. I stumbled back, my breath quickening as I fought the urge to scream. The man stepped forward, and I could see he was not quite right. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the growl still echoing behind me. I darted through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop to look back, driven by instinct. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every shadow morphing into something sinister. I finally reached the main path and sprinted toward my truck, fumbling with my keys as I desperately tried to get the engine to start. Just as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, illuminated by my headlights. But as I drove away, my pulse racing, I realized I hadn't seen him alone. I had glimpsed the couple huddled behind him, their eyes wide with terror, as if they were under some kind of spell. I returned to the ranger station and reported everything. We launched a search team back into the woods, but when we arrived, there was no sign of the couple. The area was as quiet as it had been when I first found the tent. The park was deemed safe, but I knew what I had seen. The ranger community brushed it off as a story, a figment of my imagination after being out in the woods too long. Years later, I still hear whispers when the wind howls through the trees. I've moved on, taking a different job away from the woods, but something lingers in my mind. I wonder if the couple ever made it out. Or perhaps they are still there, trapped in that darkness, forever watching the woods for the next park ranger who dares to venture too close. It was late October when I signed up for a solo shift as a park ranger, patrolling the trails after dark. The deep woods were always eerie at night, but there was something about the fall air that made the trees seem closer, the shadows thicker. I had patrolled the park dozens of times before, but something about that night felt different. My flashlight was weak, its beam barely cutting through the mist that had settled over the forest. The towering pines creaked in the wind as I made my way down one of the less traveled paths. I had heard stories over the years, rumors about strange things happening deep in these woods. Most of the time, it was just old campers telling ghost stories around a fire. I never believed them until that night. As I moved deeper into the woods, I came across an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tent looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were no signs of wildlife, no rustling of leaves or chirping of insects. The stillness was unnerving. I radioed in to let the others know I had found the site, but there was no response, just static. My heart began to race. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to go further. A thick fog had started to roll in, making it even harder to see. The path twisted and narrowed, and soon I found myself in an area of the park I had never seen before. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. I checked my map and compass, but neither seemed to make sense. The compass needle spun wildly, as if it were confused, and the map didn't match my surroundings. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't lost, I couldn't be. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of trees, it was something else. A low, guttural moan echoed through the woods, followed by the snap of a branch. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was tall to tall. My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The sound came again, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent once more. I forced myself to move, slowly backing away from the direction of the sound. I had to get back to the main trail, back to the ranger station. But no matter which way I turned, the trees seemed to close in on me, blocking my way. As I stumbled through the fog, I saw something ahead, to glowing orbs floating in the distance. My heart leapt into my throat. They were eyes, reflecting in the beam of my flashlight. They were watching me. I pointed the light straight at them, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something large and gaunt, standing just beyond the fog. It looked human, but its limbs were elongated, and its skin was pale as moonlight. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. My legs burned as I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, moving faster than any human could. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I burst into a clearing. My chest heaved, and my body ached, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights in the distance. I threw myself through the door and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I returned to the area with another ranger. The fog had lifted, and the woods looked normal, peaceful even. But when we reached the clearing where I had first seen the creature, we found something strange. There, in the soft earth, were footprints, giant human-like prints, much larger than any person's. They led deep into the woods and disappeared into the darkness. We never spoke about it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there had let me go. It had been watching, waiting, and it knew I would come back. I have always loved the solitude of the deep woods. As a park ranger, I spent my days monitoring trails, maintaining campsites, and ensuring that everyone enjoyed their time in nature safely. One chilly autumn evening, I was assigned the last shift of the season, just as the leaves were starting to fall and the air turned crisp. Little did I know that this night would change my perspective on the forest forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set out on my usual patrol. The trees towered over me, their skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, a sound that usually brought me comfort, but tonight it felt ominous. I had always been aware of the stories the locals spoke of strange happenings in these woods, whispers of creatures lurking just beyond the trees. I never paid them much mind, chalking it up to urban legends meant to scare children. About an hour into my shift, I noticed something unusual. Off the main trail, a flickering light danced through the trees. My curiosity piqued. I cautiously approached, thinking it might be a group of campers in need of help. As I got closer, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. As I turned back to the path, I heard a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I glanced over my shoulder, but the forest was still. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind playing tricks. However, The feeling of being watched pressed heavily on my chest. I continued my patrol, but the unease lingered. As I approached the campsite where a family was staying, I noticed their tent was zipped shut, and the campfire was still burning, casting flickering shadows. I called out to them, but there was no response. I stepped closer, peering inside the tent, and saw it empty, with no sign of the family. My heart raced. Where could they have gone? Just then, a loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a chilling scream. The sound came from deeper in the woods, sending my adrenaline into overdrive. I sprinted towards the source, fear gripping my heart. Each step felt heavier, and the darkness seemed to stretch out before me. Waiting. As I reached a small clearing, I stumbled upon something terrifying. The ground was torn up, as if a massive animal had been digging frantically. The scream had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my beam cutting through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and the scattered remnants of what looked like a picnic, broken plates, an overturned cooler. Then I saw a shadow moving between the trees. My heart raced as I called out again, this time louder. The shadow paused, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale and twisted, staring back at me. It vanished before I could process what I had seen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned to flee back towards the trail. In my panic, I tripped over a root and fell to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard a low growl emanating from the darkness. It sounded closer now. My instincts kicked in, and I ran, branches scratching at my arms as I pushed through the underbrush. I had to get back to my truck, back to safety. Finally, I burst out onto the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned back, scanning the shadows. Nothing followed. I reached my truck, fumbling for the keys as the growl echoed in my mind. Just as I was about to start the engine, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The family I had thought was missing stood just outside the tree line. They appeared disheveled, eyes wide with terror, but unharmed. I leapt out, relieved they were safe. As I approached, I noticed something behind them. The twisted figure I had seen earlier was standing silently, its grotesque form illuminated by the headlights of my truck. But instead of lunging at us, it simply stood there, watching. The family had been lost, but had found their way back when they heard the scream, which was not their own, but rather a warning to escape. The creature, whatever it was, had been trying to protect them from something far worse lurking deeper in the woods. We stood together in shock, realizing that sometimes the real monsters are the unseen forces that drive fear into our hearts. With the morning light creeping in, we hurried out of the woods, grateful to have survived the night, but forever haunted by what we had encountered in the shadows. I always thought being a park ranger would be a peaceful job. I spent my days hiking the trails, keeping an eye on the wildlife, and sharing my love for the outdoors with visitors. But that all changed one fateful autumn night. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped up my last patrol and headed back to the ranger station. The woods took on a different feel after dark, and even though I was alone, I felt a strange sense of unease. I locked up the station and decided to take a short walk before heading home. There was something about the silence that drew me in. I wandered deeper into the woods, the flashlight beam dancing between the trees. The familiar paths felt different in the dark, and every crack of a twig made my heart race. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, a low, grating sound. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered in the forest. It sounded almost like someone whispering, but there was a raspy edge to it. I shivered, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Continuing my walk, I stumbled upon an old camping site. The fire pit was cold, the logs arranged haphazardly. I remembered this spot. It was a popular camping area for families. I pulled out my radio, ready to check in with the other rangers, when I noticed something strange. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the site, but they were mixed with something else, something that looked like claw marks. My heart began to pound as I knelt to inspect them. The prints were large, almost too big to belong to any animal in the area. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. That's when I heard it again, the grating whispering. It was closer this time. I swung my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I stepped back, feeling a chill run down my spine. The whispers intensified, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and sprinted back toward the path, the light bouncing erratically in front of me. Just as I rounded a corner, my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled forward, crashing to the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, extinguishing the only source of light. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. In the darkness, the whispers became louder, almost mocking. I finally managed to get it working again and aimed the beam into the trees. I was greeted by a horrifying sight. Standing just outside the circle of light was a figure. Tall and thin, with long, gangly limbs, it stood perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I bolted to my feet and ran. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, echoing all around me. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I raced down the path. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and leaned against it, panting heavily. After a few moments, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I was just tired from my long day. I flipped the light on and checked my radio. Just as I was about to call it a night, a chilling sound broke through the silence. A soft knock echoed from the door. My heart raced as I approached, hesitantly peering through the window. Outside stood a family, mom, dad, and 2 kids, looking lost and frightened. They explained they had been camping nearby when they heard strange sounds and saw a figure in the woods. They had fled, thinking they would find help. My body relaxed, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. I welcomed them in and made them comfortable while I called for assistance. They described the whispers and the figure, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. As I turned to grab some extra blankets, I glanced back at the window, and that's when I saw it again. The tall, thin figure was standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. But this time, it wasn't alone. The trees were alive with movement, and all around the figure were dozens of those same twisted silhouettes, all staring in silence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I wasn't crazy. The whispers hadn't been in my head. The forest had been hiding something much darker all along. The family beside me had unwittingly stumbled into something I had barely escaped, and now it felt like it was closing in. I had been a park ranger for several years, but nothing prepared me for that night. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my boots as I patrolled the remote campground. It was late October, and most campers had left. I enjoyed the solitude of the deep woods, the silence that only nature could provide. But on that night, an unsettling feeling crept over me, like fingers of cold dread wrapping around my spine. As I checked the campsites, my radio crackled to life. The voice of another ranger broke through the static. He reported a family that had set up camp late in the day. They planned to stay overnight but had not checked in. This wasn't unusual, but my instincts told me something was off. I decided to investigate, walking deeper into the woods. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the tall trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As I approached the family's campsite, I noticed an odd stillness in the air. The chirping of crickets had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I found the tent still standing, but there was no sign of the family. I called out to them, but my voice echoed back with no response. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap, peering inside. Their belongings were scattered about: sleeping bags, cooking gear, but no people. Panic gnawed at my stomach. Suddenly, I heard rustling nearby. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a small animal scurrying into the underbrush. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, but then I heard a low growl coming from the tree line. The sound was unlike anything I had ever encountered, a guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. I stepped back, trying to rationalize it. It could be a bear, I thought, but deep down, I knew this was different. The growl was closer now, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get back to the ranger station and call for help, but as I turned to leave, A sharp rustle came from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the bushes. I bolted toward the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight beam flickered erratically as I sprinted, the shadows seeming to twist and stretch around me. I dared a glance back, but nothing was there. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but I pressed on, pushing through the underbrush dot as I reached the main trail. I heard laughter, a child's laughter echoing from the campsite. Confused, I stopped in my tracks. The family must have returned, I thought. I called out, relief flooding through me. I turned back toward the clearing, but there was only darkness. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Just then, a voice broke the stillness, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Help us! I froze, the blood draining from my face. It sounded like the family. I raced back to the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the tent was still empty. I called out again, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? My flashlight beam flickered wildly as I scanned the area. That's when I saw them figures standing just beyond the tree line. They looked like the family, but they were all turned away from me, their backs facing the campsite. Are you okay? I shouted, my voice trembling. They didn't respond, just stood there motionless. I stepped closer, dread pulling in my stomach. And that's when I realized they weren't moving at all. Their clothes were tattered, and their hair hung in wild tangles. The moonlight illuminated their forms, and my breath caught in my throat. With a sudden rush of fear, I turned and ran back toward my truck. I could feel something hot on my heels, a presence that I dared not look back at. I jumped into the vehicle, slamming the door and locking it tight. My hands shook as I started the engine, and as I sped away, I caught a glimpse of the figures in my rearview mirror. Standing silently, watching. Later, I reported the missing family. Search teams combed the area for days, but found no trace of them. The park closed for the season, and the other rangers reassured me that it was likely to be just a case of people getting lost, but I knew what I saw. I often wonder if they are still out there, trapped in the woods, forever whispering for help, their laughter fading into the night, their figures watching from the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander too far into the dark. As a park ranger, I had seen my share of odd things in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for the night of the storm. It was late October, and the trees had shed most of their leaves, leaving the forest eerily bare. The air felt thick with anticipation as I patrolled the campground, the wind rustling the branches overhead like whispers of a forgotten language. I had just finished my usual rounds when the first raindrops began to fall. I headed back to my truck, ready to ride out the storm. That's when I received the radio call. A family had set up camp in a remote area, and they reported strange noises coming from the woods. Their kids were terrified, and the father asked for someone to check it out. I hesitated. I knew that area was notoriously isolated. Still, I felt a duty to help Dot with the rain now pouring. I drove as far as I could on the muddy trail, parking a good half-mile from their campsite. The light from my flashlight flickered in the dark, illuminated only by the occasional crack of lightning. I felt an unsettling chill as I walked toward their tent, the wet ground squelching beneath my boots. The sound of rain drowned out the forest sounds, creating an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Upon reaching the campsite, I called out to them. No answer. I peered into the tent, half expecting to see the family huddled inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags were neatly arranged, their backpacks untouched. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back, scanning the area, when I heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the nearby thicket. Adrenaline surged through me, but I couldn't abandon my duty. I called out again, asking if anyone was there. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Just as I turned to leave, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and slender, stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't look human. The figure stepped closer, and my heart raced as I tried to make out its features. It was all wrong to tall, limbs elongated, and its skin glistened like wet bark. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I knew I couldn't leave without confirming the family's safety. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and shone my flashlight in its direction. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing not one figure, but several shadows shifting just beyond the trees, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. I felt a rush of panic as I realized they were closing in on me, the growling growing louder. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a chilling mix of anger and desperation. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the wet ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I darted through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I could hear them behind me, their movements swift and unnatural, and I pushed myself to go faster, fueled by sheer terror. As I burst back onto the main trail, the growling ceased. I stopped, panting heavily, glancing back into the woods. The darkness loomed silent, as if nothing had ever been there. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. Just as I was about to call for help, I caught sight of a flicker of movement in the trees. It was then that I saw them. The family I had come to find was standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring at me with wide eyes. They were unharmed, but their faces were pale, their expressions frozen in fear. I rushed over, relief flooding my chest. I asked what had happened. The father shook his head, his voice trembling. They had been hearing strange noises all night, but when they stepped out of the tent to investigate, they saw something in the shadows watching them. They didn't know what it was, but it terrified them into staying inside. As we gathered around my truck, the father suddenly pointed behind me. I turned slowly, dread washing over me. Just beyond the trees stood the figure again, but this time it was smiling, a twisted grin splitting its face. My heart dropped as the realization hit me. It had been playing with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. In that instant, the lights on my truck flickered, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck. The family clutched each other, and I could feel my body tense as the air grew thick with malice. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We had survived for now, but the woods were still alive with something sinister, and we were far from safe. As a park ranger, I had grown accustomed to the eerie stillness of the woods. It was mid-October, and the vibrant autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Most visitors had left, leaving the park in a haunting solitude that felt almost alive. I was patrolling the area when I received a call over the radio. A family had reported hearing strange noises outside their tent, something that sounded large and menacing. I set out on foot, a flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The night air was thick with tension, and the shadows loomed ominously among the trees. The path to the campsite felt longer than usual, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The family had set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the main trails. As I approached, I noticed an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. When I reached their campsite, the tension in the air became palpable. The tent was unzipped but empty, their belongings strewn about haphazardly. My gut twisted as I called out for them. No response. I stepped inside the tent, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Everything appeared untouched, but the unsettling absence of the family gnawed at me. I heard it then, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back outside, scanning the perimeter. My heart raced as I noticed fresh claw marks on the ground, deep and jagged, surrounding the tent. I cursed under my breath, my instinct screaming that something was very wrong. I should have turned back then, but my ranger training kicked in. I had to find them. I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out for the family. The growl reverberated through the trees again, closer this time. It was guttural, a sound that belonged to something primal. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, its movement too swift for a human. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a tall, lanky silhouette with glowing eyes. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the darkness swallowing my light. I turned and ran, branches scratching at my arms as I darted through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, its growl morphing into a harsh cackle that pierced the night. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, desperate to escape whatever hunted me. Finally, I burst onto a familiar trail, breathless and disoriented. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup, my voice a frantic whisper in the static. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but fear clawed at my insides. As I waited, I could hear the rustling in the bushes, that low growl echoing closer. I turned, prepared to face whatever came next. Moments later, another ranger arrived, flashlight beaming into the dark. Relief washed over me, but I quickly warned him of the creature. We gathered our courage and approached the family's campsite, but the creature was gone. The only signs of disturbance were the deep claw marks and the ransacked tent. Then we heard its screams coming from deeper in the woods. My stomach twisted as we sprinted toward the sound, hearts pounding. What if we were too late? As we reached a clearing, we saw the family huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The relief was overwhelming until I turned to see what they were pointing at. In the center of the clearing stood the creature, its long limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. But then I realized something horrifying. The creature was mimicking the father's voice. "Help me," it called, but the tone was twisted, dripping with malice. It wasn't just a monster. It was a horrifying imitation, feeding on their fear. In that moment, everything clicked. The growls were not of a beast, but of a being capable of deception. It fed on the fear of its prey, luring them into the darkness. We backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs on it, the family still frozen in shock. My heart raced as I realized our only chance was to leave this clearing. We moved together, inching backward until we were out of its reach. The creature screeched in frustration, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed the family's arms, urging them to run. The woods felt alive with danger as we raced back to safety, knowing we had escaped a fate worse than we could imagine. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back at the dark woods, knowing the true horror had only just begun. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy. Frozen in place, I watched as they danced around the fire. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves, eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed. I have always loved the deep woods, the way the tall trees whisper secrets as the wind moves through them. As a park ranger, my job was to protect these woods and the visitors who came to enjoy them. It was mid-October when I received a call about a group of campers who hadn't checked in. I grabbed my gear and set out into the forest, ready to find them. The sun had set by the time I reached their designated campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tents were still pitched, but the area was unnaturally quiet. No laughter, no sounds of wrestling gear. I called out, hoping for a response, but silence met me. I stepped inside the nearest tent. Their sleeping bags were untouched, and the gear was scattered but still there. My heart raced as I realized something was wrong. I scanned the area, looking for signs of a struggle, but found nothing except a small trail leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow it. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. The air grew heavier, the sounds of the forest fading into an eerie stillness. As I walked, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I stopped and turned, half expecting to see a fellow ranger or the campers behind me, but I was alone. I pressed on, my instinct screaming at me to turn back. I heard a snap of a twig behind me and spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The trail led me to a small clearing where the moonlight spilled onto the ground, illuminating what looked like a campsite. There was a fire pit, but it hadn't been used in a long time. I approached cautiously, scanning for any signs of life. That's when I saw a shape in the shadows near the tree line. I squinted, trying to make it out, and my heart stopped. It looked like a person, but something was off. The figure was hunched over, and as I stepped closer, I could see it was covered in dirt and leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I called out, trying to sound brave. "Hello. Are you okay?" The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by hair and grime. It opened its mouth to speak, but what came out was a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, heart racing. The figure lunged forward, and I turned to run, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I sprinted back toward the main path, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I ran, branches whipped at my face, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could hear the figure crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan. I had to reach the other rangers at the visitor center. They would know what to do. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell hard onto the forest floor. I rolled over just in time to see the figure looming above me, its breath heavy and ragged. In a moment of sheer desperation, I reached for my flashlight and shone it directly at the figure. The light caught its face, and I felt a jolt of horror as I recognized it. It was one of the campers, but not as I remembered. His eyes were wide with fear, and he was caked in mud and leaves. I stumbled back, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Where are the others?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The camper's expression shifted, a look of terror on his face. He pointed behind me, and as I turned, I froze. The rest of the campers stood at the edge of the clearing, but they were not alone. A group of twisted figures circled them, their bodies unnaturally contorted, faces hidden beneath matted hair. As the figures moved closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees, but it wasn't the joyous laughter of campers. It was taunting, sinister. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the truth. The campers were playing a game, a sick, twisted game in the dark, luring me in. The laughter crescendoed, and for a moment, I was paralyzed by fear. But as I stood there, I remembered my training. I was a park ranger, not a victim. I turned and ran, this time not looking back. I burst through the tree line and onto the main path, gasping for air. I kept running until I reached the visitor center, where I collapsed against the door, heart pounding. I told my fellow rangers everything, but they only stared at me, confusion in their eyes. I knew what I saw, but when we returned to the campsite, there was nothing. No campers, no signs of struggle, just an empty campsite in the moonlight. It was as if they had never existed at all. To this day, I still patrol those woods, and when the wind whispers through the trees, I hear their laughter echoing in the night. I know they are still out there, somewhere in the deep woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to join their gang. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the woods, but nothing could prepare me for that particular night in late October. The air was crisp, and the trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels against the moonlight. I had just finished a routine check of the campgrounds when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. It caught my eye because it was unusual. Most campers were already tucked away in their tents by this hour. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my flashlight and set off toward the light. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as I walked deeper into the trees. With each step, a sense of unease crept in. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the trunks, illuminating the gnarled branches that twisted like skeletal fingers. As I got closer, I could see the light was coming from a clearing. It pulsed and flickered as if something was wrong with it. When I finally stepped into the clearing, my heart sank. In the center stood a small campfire, but there were no tents, no campers. Just the fire, sputtering in the chilly night air. I scanned the area, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. It was too quiet, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just the fire crackling, and an overwhelming sense of dread enveloping me. Then I saw a figure darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. My breath hitched in my throat. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figure moved too fast, too erratically to be human. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it vanished before I could catch a glimpse. Deciding to investigate further, I edged toward the fire. The flickering light illuminated something unusual at the edge of the flames, a backpack. I knelt down to inspect it, and as I reached for the zipper, I heard a low growl behind me. My heart raced as I whipped around, flashlight raised. The beam landed on the same figure from before, now standing just outside the light. It was tall, hunched, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed like embers, fixated on me. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming for me to run. The growl intensified, and in a panic, I bolted back toward the trail. I could hear it following me, its breath ragged and heavy as it closed the distance. I didn't look back, focusing only on the path ahead, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. Just as I thought I might be free, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through my knee as I scrambled to my feet. The creature was close now, its growl echoing in the stillness. I took off again, adrenaline surging through my veins, ignoring the throb in my leg. I could hear the rustling of leaves, branches snapping underfoot, but I didn't dare to look back. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the main path. The familiar surroundings were a brief comfort, but the creature was still behind me. I sprinted towards the ranger station, my breath coming in ragged gasps, praying I'd make it in time. As I reached the station, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, heart pounding. I grabbed the radio to call for help, but was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing once more. The knocking came again, but this time it was gentle, almost pleading. I peered through the window. My eyes widened in disbelief. Standing at the door was a child, maybe 10 years old, wearing a tattered jacket. "Help me, please," she said, voice shaking. I quickly unlocked the door and let her in, confusion swirling in my mind. "Where are your parents?" I asked, glancing back toward the woods, half expecting the creature to appear. She pointed toward the forest. "They're lost. I heard something bad." I ran. Before I could respond, the radio crackled to life. "This is dispatch. We received a call about a missing child. Do you copy?" My stomach dropped. The child before me wasn't a lost camper. She was part of the missing family, and the creature wasn't after me. It was trying to protect her. I turned to look back outside, just as the growl echoed once more through the trees. I now understood what had happened. The woods were alive with a danger I could barely comprehend, and I had unwittingly walked into the middle of it. The child was safe for now, but the true terror of the forest was still lurking just outside. I had been working as a park ranger for a couple of years when I received a call one late autumn evening. The park was known for its picturesque landscapes and quiet trails, especially in the fall, when the leaves transformed into vibrant hues of orange and red. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I was on my regular patrol. I checked in with the ranger station and then turned my truck onto a secluded road, ready to survey the farthest reaches of the park. The radio crackled with the sound of frantic voices. A family of campers had set up near a remote lake and reported strange noises surrounding their campsite. They described low growls and something large moving through the trees. I chuckled at their fear, assuming it was just wildlife. I decided to reassure them. Driving through the dimming light, the air turned colder. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. When I arrived at the campsite, I found the family gathered around the dying embers of their fire. They looked pale, wide-eyed, clearly shaken. As I approached, I noticed the way they huddled close together, as if afraid to venture too far from one another. The father spoke first, voice trembling. He explained that they had heard noises since sunset. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but then they heard a deep growl, not like anything they had ever encountered before. I reassured them, telling them it was probably just a bear looking for food, but they didn't seem convinced. I suggested we take a quick look around the perimeter of their campsite. After all, there were no other rangers in the area, and I wanted to make sure they felt safe. Armed with flashlights, we fanned out, scanning the tree line. As we walked, the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. The family kept close, and I could feel their unease. My flashlight flickered as we ventured deeper into the woods, illuminating the dense underbrush. I suddenly heard a low growl echoing through the trees, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I turned to the family, ready to tell them to stay calm, but the look of terror on their faces said everything. Just then, the growl turned into a high-pitched shriek, echoing through the night. My instincts kicked in, and I urged the family to retreat to their campsite. As we hurried back, I heard something crashing through the woods behind us. My heart raced as I shone my flashlight into the dark, desperate to see what was pursuing us. A flicker of movement caught my eye, but when I turned, nothing was there. The family was ahead of me, and I called out for them to keep moving. We reached the safety of their campsite, panting heavily. The father hurriedly stoked the fire, and I scanned the tree line for any signs of movement. There was nothing, just the wind whispering through the branches. The family settled back around the fire, still trembling. I could feel the fear hanging in the air, thick and tangible. I told them I would stay the night, ensuring they were safe. As the hours passed, the sounds of the forest settled into a haunting silence. We shared ghost stories to keep the mood light, but every rustle in the trees made us jump. At one point, the father suggested we check the perimeter again. I hesitated, but we agreed it was best to know if whatever was out there was still watching us. Equipped with our flashlights once more, we crept back toward the tree line. The air was heavy, and the night felt alive with anticipation. Suddenly, the high-pitched shriek rang out again, piercing the silence like a knife. I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. We turned and ran back to the campsite, fear propelling us forward. But as we reached the clearing, the family froze, and I skidded to a halt behind them. There, in front of the tent, stood a tall figure, backlit by the glow of our fire. It was a park ranger, wearing a uniform eerily similar to mine, but something was off. His face was pale, I sunk in, and his lips curled into a grotesque smile. I stepped forward, confusion flooding my mind. But before I could say anything, the figure raised his hand and pointed towards the forest. In a voice that sent chills through my bones, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The family screamed, and I felt a rush of panic. I turned to look back at the figure, but he had vanished, leaving only the echoes of his words hanging in the air. The family and I huddled together, trying to make sense of what we had seen. Knowing we had to leave the woods behind, we packed up quickly and fled, the night feeling colder and darker than before. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had encountered was not done with us yet. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that figure's chilling voice and wonder who or what was truly watching us in those woods. The sun was setting behind the trees as I drove deeper into the forest, the fading light casting eerie shadows on the winding dirt road. As a park ranger, I was accustomed to the quiet beauty of these woods, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with tension, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I had just received a report of a family camping near the edge of the park who hadn't checked in. As I parked near their campsite, I could see their tent in the distance, illuminated by a single lantern. I called out as I approached, but there was no response. I felt an unsettling knot in my stomach. The area was usually bustling with the sounds of nature, but the silence was overwhelming. The faint rustle of leaves made me jump, and I steeled myself for what I might find. When I reached the tent, I noticed the zipper was slightly open. I pushed it aside and peeked in, empty. The sleeping bags were still laid out, and the family's belongings were untouched. I called their names, but was met only by the rustling of branches and the distant call of an owl. My heart raced as I scanned the surrounding woods, looking for any sign of movement. I decided to check the nearby clearing, hoping to find them there. As I stepped away from the campsite, I felt a chill in the air. A sense of unease washed over me. I ventured further into the woods, the shadows growing longer and darker. The silence was oppressive. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the trees, making me jump. My flashlight beam swept across the underbrush, but nothing was there. I continued walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. My thoughts raced through scenarios. Had they gotten lost? Were they hurt? Just as I was about to turn back, I heard laughter in the distance. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The laughter sounded wrong, echoing and distorted, as if it were mocking me. I hurried toward the sound, calling out to the family. The laughter faded, replaced by a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, the growl, closer this time. My instincts kicked in, and I felt the need to get back to the tent. I turned to head back, but the path seemed unfamiliar. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. Panic set in as I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding. I tried to retrace my steps, but the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, disorienting me. I called out again, hoping for a response, but all I got was silence. Then, from behind me, I heard the laughter again, louder this time, echoing in my ears. It wasn't the sound of children, it was something sinister. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The growl was now a snarl, and I could feel something pursuing me. I burst into a small clearing, my flashlight flickering. In the center stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. My blood ran cold as I realized I was not alone. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the figure's twisted face, a grotesque parody of a human smile stretching from ear to ear. In a panic, I turned to run again, the laughter morphing into a cacophony of voices, whispering my name, taunting me. I sprinted through the trees, my mind racing for a way out. Suddenly, I tripped and fell, the ground giving way beneath me. I landed hard, gasping for breath, and looked around. The figure loomed closer, but just as it reached out, I felt something cold grab my ankle. It yanked me back, but instead of panic, I felt relief wash over me as I saw the familiar shape of the family I had been searching for. They had been camping a few yards away, and it turned out they had wandered off for a night hike. They pulled me up just as the figure receded into the shadows, the laughter fading into the night. We scrambled back to the campsite, breathless but safe. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I glanced back into the woods, wondering if what I had seen was real or a trick of the mind. Later, while recounting the story to them, I noticed the family exchanging glances, their expressions troubled. They spoke softly among themselves, and it struck me that their laughter hadn't been joyful. It had been the same mocking laughter I heard in the woods. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever lurked in those woods had not only been after me, it had been playing with all of us. It was a late autumn evening when I began my shift as a park ranger. The air was crisp, and the last vestiges of daylight seeped through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. I loved this time of year. The vibrant colors, the quiet that enveloped the woods as most campers had already packed up for the season. I took my first stroll down the main trail, making sure everything was in order. About an hour into my rounds, I received a radio call from a family camping near the far end of the park. They reported odd noises outside their tent, sounds that didn't match the usual wildlife. I assured them I would head over immediately. Their campsite was a good hike away, and with each step, I felt the growing tension in the air, as if the woods were holding their breath. By the time I reached their site, the sun had completely vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the clearing. The tent was unzipped, and I called out, but no one answered. I shone my flashlight into the tent. Their belongings were scattered inside, but the family was nowhere to be found. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. That's when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, reverberating through the trees. It sent a shiver racing up my spine. I turned off my flashlight, straining to hear better. The growl came again, louder, closer. It wasn't a bear. It felt almost human, twisted in some unnatural way. I backed out of the tent slowly, my heart pounding. As I stepped outside, the hairs on my neck stood on end. My flashlight flickered, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. I called out for the family, my voice shaky and barely audible. Then, just at the tree line, I saw a figure, tall and thin, partially obscured by darkness. It stood unnaturally still, its head tilted at an odd angle. I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the creature took a step forward, and I could see its face, or what I thought was a face. It was pale, featureless except for deep, hollow eye sockets. My breath caught in my throat as it let out another growl, echoing through the night. I sprinted back to my vehicle, adrenaline propelling me forward. I fumbled for the radio, trying to call for backup, but the static crackled loudly, making my heart race even faster. I finally managed to get a message out, desperate for someone to respond. I jumped into the truck and locked the doors, staring out into the abyss of trees surrounding me. Moments felt like hours, and I was about to lose hope when another ranger arrived, his headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as he stepped out. I quickly explained what I had seen, my words tumbling out in a rush. He listened intently, and as we prepared to search for the family, we heard something, the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing through the trees. Confused, we followed the sound. It led us deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick I could hardly see. Then we stumbled into a small clearing. There they were, the family, huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and laughing like nothing was wrong. I felt my heart drop. I rushed toward them, demanding to know where they had been. The father looked at me with a puzzled expression. They had heard the growl, but assumed it was just a bear and decided to wait it out. I was flooded with relief, but something felt off. As we gathered around the fire, I noticed the mother was pale, her hands trembling. She glanced nervously toward the trees. I followed her gaze, and suddenly, the air grew cold. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, haunting growl. The family's faces turned to shock as the figure stepped into the light, its movements slow and deliberate, but then it stopped, hovering at the edge of the firelight. I was sure it would attack, but instead, it turned its head and looked directly at me, those hollow eye sockets boring into my soul. Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the fire flared up brightly, and in that moment, the figure simply vanished. The family stood frozen, their faces white with fear. The growl faded into silence. We all looked at one another, unsure of what had just happened. What was real? Had I imagined the creature? Or had it truly been there? The night ended with us all packed tightly together around the campfire, the eerie silence settling around us like a shroud. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are not as empty as they seem. I hear whispers in the wind and feel eyes watching me. Whatever was lurking in the shadows that night might not be gone for good.